This morning I'm going to deal with the Great Reset Part 2. The first Sunday I did Part 1, and at that time I dealt with the goals of the Great Reset. I talked about how they are looking to create a utopia of their own, and this has been the case for hundreds of years. There have been different groups. Communism itself was set up as a utopia, as an answer to all the world's problems, the hunger, the inequalities, the inefficiencies of government, and so on. Well, that's what the Great Reset is trying to do as well. Create that global utopia, one world government. Eliminate poverty, distribute wealth so no one is in need. Those are great goals, aren't they? Rebalance investment, harness science and technology, advance the transition to net zero carbon dioxide so that you have that balance, so we don't have more climate change that is negative. So they want to stabilize that, create equality for all genders and races, and govern with fairness and kindness. These seem like good goals. They have been goals for hundreds of years, really. Different societies, different countries, and this is just one that has global impact, as we shall see. But we also saw that there are problems, and we started talking about that in Part 1. Part 2, I'm going to deal with the critique. So you'll see Glenn Beck's book over there. I used Glenn Beck because with his team of researchers, he does a really good job of pinpointing what's really going on, getting into the heart of the problem. So that's why I compared him with Klaus Schwab, as you see in the middle, who co-wrote the book COVID-19, The Great Reset, in June of 2020. Now I want to take us on a route of looking at a critique. And I don't know if you get the Imprimus from, how many get Imprimus from Hillsdale? Okay, every one of you should. It's free. They already have over 6 million that they send out, the Imprimus letter, and it's excellent all the time. This particular one was written by Michael Rectenwald. He's the Chief Academic Officer of American Scholars. This was December 2021, and it is so apropos to what we're talking about. And so I'm going to go through a number of quotes that I picked out from this article. He says, "Is the Great Reset a conspiracy theory, imagining a vast left-wing plot to establish a totalitarian one-world government?" He responds, no, it's not a conspiracy theory, despite the fact that some people may have spun conspiracy theories based on it, with some reason, as we shall see. The Great Reset is real. It's not a conspiracy, it's real. It's out in the open. It's published in many ways. It's pushed throughout the world, and it has had a great effect on our world. He goes on. In brief, stakeholder capitalism involves the behavioral modification of corporations to benefit not shareholders, but stakeholders, individuals and groups that stand to benefit or lose from corporate behavior. Stakeholder capitalism requires not only corporate responses to pandemics and ecological issues such as climate change, quote, but also rethinking corporations' commitments to already vulnerable communities within their ecosystems. That's part of the ESG criteria. This is social justice, the social justice aspect of the Great Reset. You'll hear that over and over. Social justice, what about biblical justice? It's very different. He goes on, to comply with that, government, banks, and asset managers use the Environmental, Social, and Governance, ESG index, to squeeze non-woke corporations and businesses out of the market. Fortunately, there are some who are waking up to that, and this is from the Wall Street Journal. Ellen brought it in. Two conservative groups argue that the exchange targets, NASDAQ, amount to illegal quota, pushing the diversity and the ESG criteria. So, fortunately, some are fighting back. The ESG index is essentially a social credit score that is used to drive ownership and control of production away from the non-woke or non-compliant. So if you don't comply as a company, then you're pushed aside. You won't get the business. He goes on, the tendency of the Great Reset is toward monopolization, vesting as much control over production and distribution in as few favored corporations as possible, while eliminating industries and producers deemed non-essential or inimical. So the big corporations like Amazon and Facebook and Twitter, those that garner a lot of support from people around the world, will continue to be pushed into growth. They will be the favorable companies, and you'll have less and less of the competitors. And as we know in our type of market, that is not always good. Then he says, to bring this reset about, Klaus Schwab, writes, quote, every country from the United States to China must participate, and every industry from oil and gas to tech must be transformed. Notice the must, the command word there. Another way of describing the goal of the Great Reset is capitalism with Chinese characteristics. This is becoming quite interesting. A two-tiered economy with profitable monopolies and the state on top, and socialism for the majority below. And the more I read about the Great Reset and this agenda, that's exactly what they're trying to do. The elites and the government leaders will be on top, and they will have access to all the money and power that they can lust after. But the rest of the country, the rest of us plebeians, will have a type of socialism. Not the same as communism, but a type. The Great Reset represents the development of the Chinese system in the West, but in reverse. This was interesting, so I put a picture of Xi Jinping there. Whereas the Chinese political class began with a socialist political system under Mao and others, and then introduced privately held for-profit production, which has really raised their income, the West began with capitalism and is now implementing a Chinese-style political system. I really do feel that he's right on in that assessment. He goes on, the Great Reset's corporate stakeholder model overlaps with its governance and geopolitical model, States and favored corporations are combined in public-private partnerships and together have control of governance. This corporate-state hybrid is largely unaccountable to the constituents of national governments. They will be transnational. They will be global. And this is a type of fascism when you think about it. Government and the industries, the corporations working in unison for power, for control. Since these corporations are multinational, the state essentially becomes globalist, whether or not a one-world government is ever formalized. They'll do it just by their own means and agenda. And it's happening now. When you think of the big corporations that are worldwide. And then he ends with this particular hopeful point. But let me end on a note of hope. Because the goals of the Great Reset depend on the obliteration not only of free markets, but of individual liberty and free will, it is perhaps, ironically, unsustainable. Got to keep that in mind. That may be very true. Unsustainable, very good word there, especially since they push sustainability. Are they unsustainable themselves? Like earlier attempts at totalitarianism, the Great Reset is doomed to ultimate failure. I hope he's right. That doesn't mean, however, that it won't, again like those earlier attempts, leave a lot of destruction in its wake, which is all the more reason to oppose it now and with all our might. That's why we're here. We want to understand what's going on so that we can bring a biblical answer and response to this. And I'm going to get to that right at the end in my own hopeful ending for Chris's sake. Gatestone Institute is another great policy journal that I subscribe to, and talks about a lot of things. But here it's focusing on this question. J.B. Shirk writes, a blueprint for destroying freedom, innovation, and prosperity. That's how he sees it. Quote, notice that no nation has managed merely to print money and tax its citizens on the path to prosperity. Real wealth cannot simply be conjured from thin air. Yet that is something that our government right now is trying to do. A country whose institutions do not respect property rights or whose customs do not value freedom will remain a barren desert for human innovation. So his concern is that innovation will be squeezed out. And if we don't innovate, then we will go to a lesser form of existence. The World Economic Forum's agenda promotes radically anti-liberal programs that will smother human innovation by first depriving Westerners of their freedoms. We're already seeing that. Nothing about Western politicians' embrace of the World Economic Forum's Great Reset or Build Back Better paradigms protects property rights or liberty in the slightest. The WEF's agenda promotes radically anti-liberal programs that will smother human innovation by first depriving Westerners of their freedoms. So he reiterates that. Then he says this: wealthy free nations are a threat to the WEF's New World Order. That's America. If censorship must be embraced to control the narrative, then so be it. If citizens must be denied freedom of movement under the guise of a health emergency, like a pandemic, no big deal. If private bank accounts must be seized to intimidate protesters, then such threats are the price for ensuring compliance. In this way, the WEF's plans for a controlled economy intentionally reverse centuries of liberal progress. Political leaders today are dragging the West into the past, in the communist past. And then this: first, individual liberties will continue disappearing. Then the great economic engine of all innovation will dry up. Finally, wealth will return solely to the hands of a small ruling class minority, the elites, the political power mongers. This is the future of the World Economic Forum, that the Economic Forum hails as progress. But not so, he says. It is not progress. It is a recipe for human bondage. I think he has something there. So J.B. Shirk in Gatestone Institute. Let's just rehearse the real goals, or look at the real goals. Not the goals that they set, but what I see as the real goals. Control through climate change. Use climate change to bankrupt the West and destroy capitalism through Green New Deals. We'll look at that in a few minutes. Greater government control, and we already see that. Consolidate world power in the hands of the elites, governments, and heads of large corporations. And 3, worldwide socialism, one world government control. A type of socialism. Promote stakeholder capitalism, which would force governments and corporations to succumb to a new type of socialism, a new type of mandates. The ESG criteria must be carried out. And universities have their DEI agenda, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as we shall see. So the agenda, this is from Klaus Schwab, this particular quote. The Great Reset calls for nothing less than, quote, a new social contract centered on human dignity and social justice. Human dignity, not God's sovereignty, and social justice, not biblical justice. It's very different. That's Klaus Schwab. So what do they want to do with this agenda? Number 1, disrupt the current world order. Use crises to promote rapid change, pandemic, climate change, world monetary system collapsing, and so on. They want to use those crises in order to move their agenda. It's a great way to get things done quickly. Implement stakeholder capitalism, environment, social governance credentials, ESG, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI. You need to get used to these terms and acronyms. Globalism, controlled by the elites. But I give a note here. In order to accomplish their goals, the movement must first neutralize true Christianity and make it irrelevant. They're doing a pretty good job of that. There is no place for God in the Great Reset. The leaders of the Great Reset are not religious at all. They're mostly atheists or agnostics. And in a previous lesson, I used this particular slide, the ultimate goal of what's going on. And I said this about my own opinion. I believe that the ultimate goal of our present-day atheistic Marxist movement, found in the Great Reset, in America, is to destroy Christianity and create a society based on socialism or communism, a certain type of socialism, a new type. They want to deny that Jesus is God and that his death on the cross can bring us salvation. So in other words, there's a program of de-Christianization, and we need to be opposed to that. We need to be aware of what's going on, and we need to fight for biblical justice. Okay, this is just kind of a scenario of three things that happened recently, and the need for a crisis to promote rapid change. It's interesting when you look back. Step one, I believe, was the first simulation back in May 2018. This was called the Clade X pandemic simulation. And they put out this point. Quote, in the end, the outcome was tragic, the most catastrophic pandemic in history with hundreds of millions of deaths, economic collapse, and societal upheaval. So they ran this simulation. They saw that about 40 million people would have died in the United States, hundreds of millions around the world, and it was a different type of virus at that point, 2018. A year later, they did another simulation. They did this in New York City. They had leaders from around the world participate in the simulation because they wanted to determine what could they do as a world, different countries, if something like this happened. They used the SARS virus, like COVID, as their simulated virus. Quote, the next severe pandemic will not only cause great illness and loss of life, but could also trigger major cascading economic and societal consequences that could contribute greatly to global impact and suffering. That was in October 2019, October. 6 months later, boom, we have the real COVID-19 pandemic upon us. And Klaus Schwab declared on June 3rd, 2020, that, quote, the pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world to create a healthier, more equitable, and more prosperous future. Crisis is great for change. And there are those who said, look for the crisis. Don't waste it. Don't waste any crisis. From simulation to reality. Since then, and this is from another article on government policy, just about every scenario covered, the Clade X and Event 201 simulations has come into play. Look at this list. Governments implementing lockdowns worldwide, the collapse of many industries. These were projected. Growing mistrust between governments and citizens, a greater adoption of biometric surveillance technologies, especially in China. Social media censorship in the name of combating misinformation, the desire to flood communication channels with authoritative sources only, get rid of the misinformation or what they call the misinformation, global lack of personal protective equipment, the breakdown of international supply chains, mass unemployment, rioting in the streets, and a whole lot more. That did come about. They projected that. I want to introduce this book. Brad and Kevin made note of this. The Naked Communists, it was first written in 1958. It told about all their plans by Skousen. And sold over 2 million copies. Reagan, there's a quote there from Reagan, really endorsed it, and he added to it. This is a new one, 2017. I believe it was published, and they added another chapter and on the 45 communist goals, detailing 45 communist goals, detailing how 44 of those goals have been achieved in the U.S. already. So for the price of that book, I'm going to get it. I'm going to look at those 45. They have been working at that for many years, and you need to know. And guess what? Saul Alinsky, remember he's the tutor for Obama. Saul Alinsky was hired by the National Education Association to implement as many of these. And he was very successful about doing that. He passed that on to Obama. And we're seeing it come through our government in many different ways. little by little. So it's very, and maybe Kevin will deal with that later on in talking about those. I think that'd be a good task for Kevin to do. Thank you, Kevin. Okay, stakeholder capitalism. Just a couple things here. On the left side, what they promote. On the right side, the problems. Corporations would be required to balance or to be accountable for the costs and benefits they produce for society. This would force the corporations to bring more equity, sustainability, and governance into their leadership, the ESG. So they're trying to promote it as something that would be very helpful, and it sounds that way at first. Those who fail to gain ESG credits may be left behind or kicked out. Corporations, this is the critique. Corporations would become bigger players in an even bigger and more intrusive global decision-making system. So the big corporations do have more clout and more say-so now. Stakeholder capitalism may be just another name for fascism, which in essence is the alliance of corporations and governments, as I said before. So keep that in mind. Glenn Beck has this to say about stakeholder capitalism. Quote, "The real reason there are so many corporate and financial industry interests lining up to promote the Great Reset is because of money and power, the true driving force behind the reset." Keep that in mind, because that is very, very true. That is the fulfillment of the three things all the way back to the Garden of Eden: lust of the flesh, lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Power, money, and whatever else it brings. It's still there, and that's Satan's plan, and he has been carrying it out for all these millennia. Glenn Beck goes on, "In a stakeholder system, individuals are replaced by an elite group of Bond villain wannabes in the ruling class. They dictate which products and services are produced and who ought to be hired to provide them to customers, not you, the individual." And then this, "To help push business in the direction of elites in society, the elites in society deem best, the World Economic Forum, business leaders, financial institutions, activists, and government officials from around the world have developed environmental, social, and governance ESG metrics." So let's look at that for a moment. Companies rated as ESG investments are supposed to be doing things that are good for the environment and social causes. ESG is an attempt to separate out the good companies from the bad companies to help you make investment decisions. It's all to help you all. The WEF's ESG standards include 21 core metrics and 34 expanded metrics, and you've got to check them all off. It's a big list. The standards are divided into four pillars, and Glenn Beck says: principles of governance, planet, climate change, people, how you diversity, equity, inclusion, and prosperity. Okay, that's their push. Now the critique. ESG is a way of deciding who is in the club and who is out of the club. And they're pushing out a lot of people. It is not a certification. It is not necessarily better for the environment. Think EV batteries, 1,000-pound batteries that take 120 tons of earth to mine the cobalt, the copper, the lithium, the aluminum, the steel, and the plastics, and all that. And they use about 100 barrels of oil to put all that together. So there's a lot that goes in. And then you have to use all that oil to charge them up every time. Often the ESG label is decided upon political views. It is very political. Thus, ESG scores could be used to disadvantage or cut off companies that do not comply. Example is Tesla. Tesla's been pushed out because they didn't comply, so S&P does not recognize them at the moment unless they just brought them back in. But Exxon, which produces oil, which is the big specter that we have in the world, oil, oh no, but they're very high on the ESG ratings, so they know where to put their money, their control. It's interesting, too, that Elon Musk says this about ESG. He declared, quote, "ESG is a scam. It has been weaponized by phony social justice warriors." Some of the things he says are refreshing for sure. And this is from the opinions of the website that I have listed below. ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, but what it really stands for is subordinating financial markets to a narrow ideological conception of social responsibility. ESG is now shorthand for a progressive takeover of the economy. So keep that in mind. ESG is an ideological virus injecting toxic politics into every aspect of our financial markets. It's an interesting quote, but I think true. Is it on the rocks, though? BlackRock, by the way, you see the picture there, is one of the major investment companies that's been pushing this to the max. Very powerful, very demanding. One economist, Jerry Bowyer, who's a Christian, writes, quote, "The sense of ESG inevitability was a key source of the movement's power. The message was, fall in line with the inevitable march of history or get left behind." Different Left Behind series, I guess. However, after pushback from a number of Republican senators, governors, and state attorney generals against the politicization of the world of finance, there is hope for the future. So Arizona as a state and a number of other attorney generals and governors are really opposing this. And what Ellen brought in about conservative groups going against it as well, that's encouraging. We need to encourage that and see what's going on. Bowyer goes on to say that ESG is now a focus of controversy and a political risk. Then diversity, equity, and inclusion. I pulled this chart from one of the major groups. This is CFA Institute. They publish this to a lot of different corporations that are in the system. Diversity, intentional representation of different minorities or underrepresented populations with considerations of race and ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and disability status. Now, on one side, that's good. I mean, you want to have a diverse population. That's good. What are the downsides? Equity, impartially and fairly providing access to resources and support, including investment, capital, and development opportunities for minorities and underrepresented populations. So it's doing what we as a church should also have been doing for a long time in being more equitable. Actually, equity versus equality is very different, as we talked about in the past. But anyway, that's what they mean by equity. Inclusion fosters deliberate actions that allow all individuals or groups to feel valued by authentically engaging and participating in the capital markets. So everybody's included, all brands, all genders, all conceptions of who you are. However, on the critical part, I have three things to say. Diversity is blatantly prejudiced against certain people, groups, blatantly prejudiced. The equity is hypocritically unequal. It doesn't include everyone. Doesn't include the majority, really. And the demand for inclusion seeks to exclude anyone who will not accept the DEI agenda. So people like me are excluded. So it's not really diverse or equitable or inclusive in many ways. And we need to be aware of that. What about the Green New Deal? This was interesting. The goal of the Green New Deal is to have America running entirely on renewable energy by 2030. That's 8 years. At present, less than 10% of the energy produced is through renewables. Less than 10%. 90% is from fossil fuels, hydropower, and nuclear energy. We really need to rethink the nuclear energy. And France surely is. Other countries in Europe are restarting those nuclear process plants because they realize they need it. Otherwise, they're going to freeze this winter. It is projected that renewable energy would only represent about a third of American energy by 2050, even if we push as hard as we can. 1/3 is not going to cut it if you cut out all the other. And they want to get rid of cars in 2035 in California? Wow. You're going to have a lot of people walking. A lot of horses. According to the congressional budget, this was interesting, and you've heard this. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the Green New Deal proposed by AOC, and you see her in that picture over there, would cost $93 trillion or $600,000 per household. Do you have $600,000 to kind of contribute to this cause? Do you get a car? No, you have to buy your own car. You get subsidies, though, for the car. The Great Reset, well, there's not going to be any coal or oil to fuel it, right? You're not going to get any energy from that. Anyway, the Great Reset uses climate change as a means to force America to accept the inevitability of the Green New Deal. They're pushing it for a reason, for political reasons. Now, what about the myth of climate change? I found this to be very interesting. This first bit is from a pro-climate change site, NASA. They say carbon dioxide in the atmosphere warms the planet, causing climate change. We know that climate changes over time. It fluctuates. But anyway, climate change. Carbon dioxide is bad, right? Human activities have raised the atmosphere's carbon dioxide content by 50% in less than 200 years. Well, actually, from another pro-CC site, they said, just 32%. 1,800, 282 parts per million of carbon dioxide. 2022, 416 parts per million. Yes, it's been raised, but we'll see something about that in a moment. Now, these quotes are from a site that talks about the myth of climate change. Science and Public Policy, very interesting. And I'll send the paper out to you in the email. In any case, irrespective of these uncertainties, all estimates of carbon dioxide levels during the recent past are very low by the standards of earlier geological history. One is much higher, and things were growing much better. It goes on. It is therefore crystal clear that there is nothing inherently unusual nor necessarily dangerous about the extra carbon dioxide that is currently being contributed to the atmosphere by human activity, which anyway amounts annually to only about 3% of the natural flux. We're going to look at the natural flux. Together with oxygen, carbon dioxide is a staff of life for Earth's biosphere because the metabolism of plants depends upon its absorption. Increasing carbon dioxide in the range of about 200 to 1,000 parts per million even has repeatedly been shown to be beneficial for plant growth and to increase plants' efficiency of water use. They take the carbon dioxide, they use the sun's energy, they use the water that they pull up in their roots, and what do they make? Carbohydrates! And they produce oxygen. Isn't it great that we have plants that do that? And they love that carbon dioxide? Yes. So tree farms, we can use a lot of tree farms. Not these windmill farms. This was interesting. President Václav Klaus, different Klaus, of the Czech Republic, delivered to the U.S. Congress Committee on Energy and Commerce this little statement. Wow. As someone who lived under communism for most of my life, I feel obliged to say that the biggest threat to freedom, democracy, and market economy and prosperity at the beginning of the 21st century is not communism or its various softer variants, socialism. Communism has been replaced by the threat of ambitious environmentalism. The environmentalists consider their ideas and arguments to be an undisputable truth and use sophisticated methods of media manipulation and PR campaigns to exert pressure on policymakers to achieve their goals. He goes on. Their argumentation is based on the spreading of fear and panic by declaring the future of the world to be under serious threat. Have you heard that? In such an atmosphere, they continue pushing policymakers to adopt illiberal measures, impose arbitrary limits, regulations, prohibitions, and restrictions on everyday human activities, and make people subject to omnipotent bureaucratic decision-making. Now, this was written in 2007. He knew what was coming up. He had been there in communism. Man-made climate change has become one of the most dangerous arguments aimed at distorting human efforts and public policies in the whole world. And I think he's on target with that. Has there been manipulation? Is climate change being used to force companies and governments to bow down to the Great Reset agenda? or a better question would be this: how is climate change being used to force companies and governments to bow down to the Great Reset agenda? Well, often it's through truncated information, specific isolating of certain things and pushing those things. For example, this is one of their charts. They show the last 100,000 years, and they show a continuation of about 280 parts per million of carbon dioxide, okay? Then you have the dip down there, about 1,500. That's the mini ice age, when it did go down, it got colder. And then you see the end there, the last 50 years or so, just climbing up very steeply. So now it's about over 400, 32% higher than it was, 50 years ago or so. So it has climbed up. But two things they don't tell you. They don't tell you what happened before, and they don't tell you that it's not the carbon dioxide that's driving that. You know what's first? Sometimes 800 years earlier? The rise in temperature. The temperature goes up for other various reasons. It's not because of the carbon dioxide content, but the carbon dioxide follows that. They've got the cart before the horse. This is put out by the Myth of Climate Change author, and he goes back much further, and he shows in 1500 BC you had the Minoan warm period. It was much warmer than it is now. Vegetation was great. You had the Roman warm period, 150 BC, again much warmer than it is now, and they had a lot of growth. Carbon dioxide was great. You had the medieval warm period where you had grapes growing in England. You had all through Europe great farming and everything else. And you can see that it goes down. You have a cold period before it goes up. There's fluctuation. Even in the last 1,500 years, you have that fluctuation. Climate change does happen. It changes. But God is in control. He's created this planet to be able to absorb those things. And even as we try to mess it up with all kinds of pollutants and everything like that, He has adjustments in place. And when those adjustments are out of control and we destroy our planet, well, He's got another one waiting for us. New heavens and new earth. So we're okay. But what happens with countries that take upon themselves this plan? Look at Sri Lanka just recently. They call their program Vistas of Prosperity and Splendor. Yeah. Great title. Build Back Better, in their own words. The goal was this: achieving the fourfold outcome of a productive citizenry, a contented family, a disciplined and just society, and a prosperous nation. Good goals, right? So the president decided that the president of Sri Lanka decided that they would become the world's first all-organic country, and this was April 2021, a little over a year ago, okay? So the use of chemical fertilizers were banned. No nitrogen, no fertilizers. We're going to do it all organically. It was hailed as a great experiment in green policy making. So what happened? Well, the right side is the critique. The effects of the policy were devastating. The production of rice fell 20% in the first 6 months, and they had to import $450 million of rice to make up the difference just to feed their people. And because there was so little of it, the price went up 50%. So it was a lot more expensive too. Tea exports also plummeted, and they're a big tea producing country. These failures also brought on a currency crisis which led to a default on their banks. Now the country faces hardship and greater poverty and hunger. And they were fine before this, just a year or so ago. And this is a picture of their visit to the president's house, taking selfies, filling it up. They got rid of the president. He fled. He's gone. And there was one farmer that that was interviewed by Reuters. And he says this: "I cannot recall any time in the past when we had to struggle so much to get a decent harvest. Last year we got 60 bags from these 2 acres, but this time it was just 10. 1/6 because of following the Great Reset rules." That's not the only one. What about the Netherlands? You've heard of the truck truckers and the farmers protesting. The Netherlands is the world's second largest exporter of agricultural goods after the United States. You didn't know that. But farming produces nitrogen oxide. They've deemed that bad. So the government wants to cut nitrogen emissions up to 70% by 2030. And animals produce a lot of nitrogen and ammonia and other things, methane. Yeah, farmers who cannot meet their targets would be given 3 options. They've got it parsed out, to get to 2030. If they can't meet it, they can downside or switch from animal farming to crops. They can relocate to another country, or they can just quit. So those are the options. So what's the critique of this? It is projected that 1 out of 3 farms may need to close due to the government policies. So they're going to shut them down. Agriculture makes up about 7% of the Dutch economy. The largest products were flowers and plants. You can get bulbs from the Netherlands, of course. Already there's a food shortage in the Netherlands. Already! And here's a picture of a lot of the reclaimed land in the Netherlands. Beautiful farming ground, a lot of water. How will the reduction of farms in the Netherlands impact Europe and beyond? That's a question. Poverty will come, because a lot of the European countries depend on the Netherlands for their food. Is the Great Reset setting the world up for the great failure? Okay? So let me conclude. The real goals of the Great Reset we see as these 3. Control through climate change, greater government control, worldwide socialism, one world government control. Key word, control. Why do they want control? So that they can manipulate, so that they can become the kings and queens, the emperors of the land, of the world. Well, let's look at a biblical view. How can there be such a great divide? We are living in a postmodern, post-Christian world that is dominated by a secular religion, which follows a different set of plausibility structures or background assumptions out of worldviews and so on, which are derived from ungodly worldviews. I'm convinced of that. In order to break through this ungodly anarchy, and they are pushing for anarchy, we need to first understand what they believe, and that's what we're doing in this class. We also need to understand what we as Christians believe so that we can then defend what we believe, right? And refute the error of the spirit of the world, because that is very rampant. Thus, our key apologetic guide will be to understand, defend, and refute. And that's what we're doing this semester. I like the words of Joshua. We need to take them to heart. God saying to them, to Joshua, "Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed. For the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." He is with us. He is our God. He is in control of this world. He is in charge of the climate change. Rather than pulling back and hiding in our churches, this is surely the time to march forward and reclaim the land. We need to do that. Perhaps we are alive now for such a time as this. Good words from the book of Esther. So we should be looking at this, towards a biblical social contract. This is our duty, I believe. Biblical justice versus social justice. So we need to learn all about biblical justice that we can, so we can promote it. Stewardship, which is right there in Genesis, we are to be stewards of this land. We have dropped the ball in many ways. We need to take it back up, because stewardship is much better than just sustainability. And then 3, biblical anthropology versus digitization. Biblical anthropology, the true understanding of man and woman, that we are made in the image of God, and we are not a panoply of genders and misunderstood motives and hormonal dysfunctions. And digitization, we are not automatons. We're not to be used and pushed around and little cogs in the mechanism of their glorious vainglorious desires. And let me finish with a little bit from Stephen Nichols, A Time for Confidence. I really advocate this book. It's a great book. He says this: Paul knew he had to put his confidence in the gospel because nothing else can turn the human heart, nothing else solves the human dilemma. These are key words, key concepts. People think that the human dilemma is many things. Some say it's poverty or the unjust distribution of resources and wealth, the Great Reset. Some say it's war and our penchant for war, think Russia. Some simply think the human dilemma is internal and psychological, think the rest of America. As R.C. Sproul has often said, quote, "The human dilemma is this: God is holy and we are not. God is righteous and we are not." We need to remember that. Our problem is not lack of or abundance of wealth or resources. Our problem is not that we are a few degrees short of finding utopia. Our problem is the wrath of holy God. No amount of righteousness can solve the dilemma. Paul testifies to only one solution: the righteousness that comes through faith in Christ. That's our job. That's where we come in. Prevailing worldviews are wrong. The prevailing worldview did not and cannot offer real answers. Modernity says hope in man. That doesn't work. Postmodernity says abandon hope. That doesn't work either. Humans cannot live without hope. The Great Reset offers only an invented hope, a false hope, a counterfeit hope. But we have an eternal hope, the Christian hope. So blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That is our hope. And that should be the hope of every person in the world. And we are here to learn this and then to take it to them.